StarCraft has made its way to our tabletops, and so now you can finally recreate all of those iconic characters such as Jim Raynor and Kerrigan, along with your favourite units of the Terrans, Protoss and Zerg in miniature form. To celebrate the release of the StarCraft Tabletop Miniatures Game, Archon Studios have tasked me with doing something cool with the miniatures found inside this Founders Edition of the 2-player start set. And what better way to do that than by creating our very own Zerg Rush. Even if you've never played StarCraft, there is a high chance that you've heard of a Zerg Rush, but it is essentially the tactic of quickly overwhelming your enemy with cheap and disposable units. This also makes it ideal for creating a dramatic diorama, and I'll be doing just that with this plinth. I picked up this 150mm by 95mm oval plinth from Taro Model Maker, and the slope on it will allow me to add height to the scene. But before I did anything with it, I first washed it with some warm soapy water before masking off the sides. This was just to protect the finish from any glue and paint overspills. My idea was to have my Terran Marines at the top of the slope with the Zerglings swarming up towards them, but keeping the slope this uniform would have just been pretty boring. So I decided to spruce things up a little and use the plastic terrain that comes inside the start set alongside some of my trusty cork chunks. Some of the larger rune pieces would form the bulk of the surface modulation, and to make sure that I was happy with how they were positioned, I did a quick dry fit with a little post attack. The rune pieces were a good start, but my Terran Marines would need a slightly flatter surface to stand on towards the top of the slope. My solution to this problem was to reuse one of the archers found inside the kit, but first I need to remove it from the rest of its wall. I approached this with my Dremel. It makes the cutting quick, and for larger pieces like this, getting precise, finely controlled cuts is not as important. Once the column had been separated, I then broke it up into its individual sections to make it easier to arrange. Then, after cleaning up the cut points and rounding out the stone texture again, I then did another dry fit across the top of the plinth. This revealed that a few of the lower back corners did need to be sanded down further to ensure that they could be glued to the plinth and remain horizontal. Once I was happy with how everything was looking, I began supergluing all of the plastic terrain to the plinth. To recreate that disposable aspect of the Zerg Rush, I wanted a couple of fouled Zerglings to make up the floor of the slope. This was achieved by clipping away a few from their sprue and partly assembling them. I only attached one set of the legs and cut down the ones that I did attach to represent severed limbs. Once the Zergling was prepped, it was glued on its side among the rubble. This was then repeated with a second Zergling. This time, however, I used the existing leg holes as a guide to drill in some bigger holes before sanding down the other side and also gluing this to the plinth. Now, to make those holes look a little more like bullet wounds, I broke out the Tamiya putty. After mixing up a small amount, I rolled it up into some small balls and pressed them into those previously drilled holes. Then, using a pointy sculpting tool, I carefully made the ball look more like a wound by creating a dip in the center, surrounded by a ragged edge. While I still had the putty mixed up, I added a little more to one of the detached arms, created that Gore effect again, and then glued the severed arm to the base. With the dead Zerglings in place, I could start adding some living ones. For the most part, I simply followed the assembly instructions, but I did have to make a slight change to their feet. Most of the Zerglings in the kit come with their rear claws sculpted onto a small rock. Now, for your gaming purposes, this is fine. It helps to create a stronger bond and adds a little interesting height and texture to your bases. For my purpose, however, the scenic details would get in the way. So, to liberate the claws from these platforms, I first glued the Zergling into it, allowed the glue to fully dry, and then clipped away the claws. After some very careful trims with my knife and file, I was left with the rear toe claws attached to the model. This process was repeated 4 more times, but I did keep 2 of the models separate from their personal rubble piles for the time being. The assembly of the Terran Marines was much more straightforward. They were simply built as per their instructions, with only a slight repositioning required to ensure their weapons pointed a little lower. Now, while past me is busy assembling those Terran Marines, let me tell you more about the StarCraft Tabletop Miniatures Game and the box that the models I'm using came from. This is the Founders Edition of the 2-player start set, and as the name suggests, it comes with everything that 2 players need to get started playing. Inside, you will find enough miniatures to create 2 armies, each worth 1,000 points, or minerals to be more specific, of both the Terran Marines and the Zerg, including 2 iconic characters from the series, Jim Raynor and Kerrigan. In addition to these, you also have a playmat, 20 dice, a ruler, and all the tokens and cards that you need to start playing straight away. You don't even need to paint anything, as all the miniatures are cast in their own faction colours. Just assemble the minis and start playing. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Not only do we have the miniatures found inside the start set, but joining the Terra Marines we also have the Goliath, and for the Zerg, the Hydralisk, both of which are available separately. But that's not to mention the third faction, the Protoss. They have their very own starter set, which contains all the miniatures, rules, and tokens needed to play the ancient race of the Protoss in the StarCraft Tabletop Miniatures Game. I'll include some links below to where you can find out more about the game and pick up your very own Founder editions of the starter sets. Now that I had my models built, I could begin finalizing how they should be positioned across the diorama. I'd made a few comparisons during assembly to ensure that the poses worked correctly, especially with the 3 Terra Marines that I'd built. Once I had finished by dry fitting, I was able to lock these positions into place. But I didn't attach the models just yet. Instead, I drilled a series of 1mm holes into 1 foot of each of the models, and then into the terrain of the spot I intended to attach the model. Into the holes on the plinth, I then glued a short length of 1mm thick steel wire, with just enough left protruding to allow the feet of the models to be placed over them. This meant that I could keep my models separate from the plinth during the painting, and still easily attach them later on. In addition to these pins, I also glued the base rocks of those Zerglings I mentioned earlier, and these were attached directly to the plinth itself. I made sure to keep my models handy for the next step though. For this part of the build, I brought in my chunks of cork and superglued various shapes and sizes into the gaps around the terrain and dead Zerglings. This helped to better blend the rune pieces into the plinth, whilst also helping the positioning of the Terra Marines at the top. Any floaty feet could be brought back down to earth with a few well-placed chunks. I didn't completely cover the surface with cork though. To get a realistic looking surface, you want a good mixture of rubble sizes, and the remaining gaps would be filled in with some sand. Specifically, some of Siege Scenic's Mangala Plateau. The colour here wasn't important, but the fact that it comes with various grades of sand and small chunks of rock helped to vary things up a little. To fix the sand into place, I first brushed on some Mod Podge to the intended areas, sprinkled on the sand and then knocked away the excess. Any PVA-like glue will work for this, but I specifically chose Mod Podge due to its thickness. Simply put, it held those larger chunks a little easier than a more watery alternative would have done. With the entire plinth covered in rubble, dead Zerglings, cork and sand, the models were mounted to some temporary holders, and I could make a start on the painting. Which began with a black primer. For this I used a rattle can primer, specifically Colourforge's matte black, to take advantage of the milder spring weather. This colour would also help me to create shadows in all those deep recessed areas once I began building up the paint. I began with the plinth itself, and started off by giving everything a coat of Scorched Earth from the Tooth and Coats range. I applied this via my Mobius 0.3mm, which was kindly sent to me by Galeri, along with the airbrush thinner that I diluted it with. With the paint prepped, I then sprayed all the rocks and soil, steadily building up the brown, earthy tone that would serve as the recess colour. Over this, I next employed some dry brushing and loaded up my dry brush with a tiny amount of water and some Dungeon Stone Grey. This was quickly brushed across the surface so that the paint was deposited onto the hard edges of the terrain pieces and texture of the cork rock. As the previous brown still showed in those recesses and flat surfaces, it helped to create a more realistic looking stone texture. In order to build on that realism, I took some green paint, Orc Hide in this case, and mixed it with some of Pro-Acryl's Newsh. This is a medium that, in simple terms, allows you to use your acrylics like oils. Essentially, it reduces the drying time and allows you to adjust the paint once applied, whilst also reducing the paint viscosity ever so slightly. This combination of effects meant that I could paint the Orc Hide across the rocks and target those recesses in lower areas where moss would naturally form, with the Newsh allowing me to get the paint into all of that tricky rock texture. Following the moss, I then applied another dry brush over the rocks using the slightly lighter grey of Wizard Grey, before tackling the soil surrounding the rocks. For this, I created another Newsh mix with some Scabbard Brown this time around. I also added in a dash of airbrush thinner to create a consistency a little thicker than a normal wash. This mix was applied across all of that sandy texture where it helped to lighten the soil texture, whilst also providing some variation in the brown tones. To finish off the rocks, I then picked out the edges of the scenery with the lighter Wizard Grey. This can be done in a more controlled manner using a normal edge highlight, or you can use your dry brush again, whatever you find easier. With the base complete for the time being, I could turn my attention to the characters on top, starting with the Zerglings. While there are a few colour variations for both the Zerg and Terrans, I decided to go with their most common colour schemes, which for the Zerg meant brown and purple. So to begin, I gave all of my Zerglings, including the dead ones on the base, a base coat of Noble Steed Brown, which I applied via my airbrush. As the Zerg are purely organic, their colours blend much more smoothly into each other. This meant that, when I came to adding in that purple, I needed to break out the Newsh again. After creating a mixture using some Enchantress Purple, I applied this to the ends of the limbs, the undersides, the jaws, and between the carapace, with the Newsh allowing me to adjust where it had been applied. For the claws, spines, and teeth, I kept things simple, with a regular base coat of Griffon Claw. With all the base coats complete, I decided to add a little shading in the recesses using a wash of battle mud. This was applied across the carapace and the areas painted with Griffon Claw in the previous step. Which brought me neatly to the Zerg highlights. To kick these off, I lined all the claws and teeth with some of the light tan of Ivory Tusk, picked out the edges of the carapace with Satyr Brown, and finished off the highlights with some Spectral Purple over the, unsurprisingly, purple areas. My final task in painting the Zerglings was to add a little zombie gore to those wounds on the dead Zerglings. This dries with a slightly translucent, slightly glossy reddish-brown colour, mimicking drying blood perfectly. With the Zerglings complete, I could now begin work on the Terran Marines. As I was sticking with the box art colour scheme, I went with Eldar Robe and broke up my airbrush once again. This paint was applied across the entirety of the armour, but I focused my spraying from above. This left the darkest, deepest recesses as the original black, which helped to create the appearance of shading, which was pushed just a little bit further by applying a small amount of Relic Blue across the shoulders, back, and other areas that sat towards the top of the model. This brighter blue gave the impression of light hitting these areas and making them appear brighter. Following this, I broke away from the airbrush and began the regular base coats, starting out with some Surcoat Silver, which was applied all over the metallic details. Then, to paint the stock of the weapons, I used some Dungeon Stone Grey. In order to create a little shading in the recesses of the armour, along with a slightly grimy, slightly worn effect, I mixed together some Cuirass Leather and Newsh. This was applied across the entirety of the Terran Marines and wiped away from the flat surfaces so that it just remained in the recesses. Once the Cuirass Leather had dried, I then followed up with some highlights. First, I used Seafarer Blue across the armour, then Carcharodon Grey over the weapon stocks, before finally applying a highlight of Mythril Blade over the steel areas. For the raised visor, I then coated the small area with some Spartan Bronze, which brought me to the faces of the Terran Marines. To tackle these, I started out with a base coat of Dwarven Skin. Then I recreated my earlier Cuirass Leather and Newsh mixture and also used this over the skin, in much the same way that I tackled the armour. Following this, I then applied a highlight using more Dwarven Skin, and then applied a few small dots of Elven Skin over the most raised details such as the cheek, forehead and nose. The very last area to paint was the hair. I cleaned up the overspills from the previous steps using some Doom Death Black, highlighted them with some Dungeon Stone Grey, and then, with everything fully painted, I gave all of my Terran Marines, Zerglings and Plinth a coat of matte varnish. I used some of Galeri's Kalido matte varnish for this step. Once it dried, it removed any unnecessary glossiness and helped to protect my paintwork. At this stage, I was finally able to start assembling everything together. I first removed the miniatures from their temporary bases and wire holders, cleaned up their contact points and used a little superglue to mount everything to the plinth. But I wasn't done just yet. The Terran Marine kit also comes with these cool transparent components, which includes some muzzle flashes. I thought that these would look pretty good on the Terran Marines, so I clipped them from their sprue, cleaned them up and glued them to the muzzles of the two Marines. All that was left to do now was to finish off the base with some grass and moss tufts. These were also sourced from the Siege Scenics range. I specifically attached a mixture of Scorched Vanilla Tusk, Bleached Frontera Moss Tufts and Yellow-Green Moss. Once I covered the base with a good mixture of these, I removed the protective masking tape that I'd applied at the very beginning of the process, which left me with this. And here we have the finished Zerg Rush. Now, dioramas are certainly a rarity for me, but I had a great time building this one. Being able to tackle a mixture of different factions and some scenery in a single build was a fun challenge, but a welcome one, and overall I'm really pleased with the results. So, if you'd like to see me tackle more dioramas in the future, then do let me know. As I mentioned, all of the miniatures used in this kit were found inside the Founders Edition of the StarCraft Tabletop Miniatures Game starter set, and I'll include some links to those kits, and where you can find out more about the game down below. You can find all those as well as all the paint and equipment that we used in this video down in the description, along with some of my affiliate links. I've also recently partnered with Warhouse, so if you're in Australia, New Zealand, or any country for that matter, and you're looking for some discounted Warhammer, be sure to follow my links to them down below. Now before I go, let me say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep the channel going, and if you'd like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link or hit the join button below. Just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Andrew Marston, Banyevrian, Berserker, Dakota Kaburi, Daniel Dowling, David Ernst, George Kanzini Roberts, Little Templar, Maciej Savitsky, Matt's Mini Minute, Sam Sepulveda, Son of Sevatar, Swedsman, Tim, and Zeth27. And my top channel members, who are Alex Verne, Andrew Chow, Bon Johnson, Chris Toomey, Dante, Dave, Doug H, Edmund Unplugged, Ferdinand Richardson, Guy Brazant, John Gibbs, Kaiser Waffle 11, Lariat11, Mark Taylor, Misa Pogon, Nerdington Paints, Patrick K, Philip Poyer, Rhino Shaughnessy, SO, SJ Carper, The Sire Acquired, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.